At 75 years old, Elowen discovered that to her own family, she was nothing more than an old piece of furniture that no longer matched the living room decor. Expelled from the house she helped build to make way for a modern office, she heard her own son say that her time was over. But while they pointed the way to the nursing home, Elowen held tight to a rusty key, the only thing no one wanted from the inheritance, a ruined property that time and weeds had tried to hide for decades. What they called trash, Elowen called destiny, and what she found buried beneath the roots of that forgotten land wasn't just a family secret, but a treasure that would make the whole world knock on her door, begging for forgiveness. Stay with me until the end, because you'll discover how an abandoned woman transformed a dry wasteland into an empire no one could ignore, and the family's reaction when they saw what she built will leave you breathless. And if you believe that life can flourish at any age, join our community by clicking the subscribe button so you don't miss the outcome of this journey. Elowen Hartley had lived in her son's house for 3 years, ever since her husband passed away. She'd sold her own home to help Marcus and his wife Denise with their mortgage when Marcus's business hit rough times. They'd promised it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet. That was 3 years ago. The arrangement had worked well enough at first. Elowen had her own room, helped with cooking and cleaning, enjoyed time with her grandchildren. But as Marcus's tech consulting business recovered and then thrived, the house began to change around her. The modest suburban home they'd bought together was renovated, expanded, modernized. New furniture replaced old. The yard was professionally landscaped. Everything became sleek, minimalist, expensive. And Elowen, with her knitting and her old-fashioned ways, and her tendency to move slowly, began to feel like she didn't fit anymore. She could see it in Denise's eyes when she shuffled into the kitchen for her morning tea, could hear it in Marcus's voice when he suggested she might be happier somewhere with people her own age, could feel it in the way they stopped including her in conversations, stopped asking her opinion, stopped seeing her as a person, and started seeing her as an obligation. The final conversation happened on a Tuesday morning in April. Marcus sat her down at the kitchen table, Denise beside him, both wearing the kind of serious expressions people use when delivering bad news they've rehearsed. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation." Elowen had known this was coming. She'd felt it building for months. She sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, and waited. "Denise and I have been discussing our space needs. I'm expanding the business, and I need a dedicated home office. The contractor says we can convert your room into a beautiful workspace with built-in shelving and proper lighting." Elowen looked at her son, the boy she'd raised alone after his father left, worked 2 jobs to put through college, supported through every challenge and triumph. "Where would I go? We've researched some excellent assisted living facilities. There's one just 20 minutes away with activities and meal plans. You'd have your own studio apartment, and there would be people around all the time. No more lonely days." "I'm not lonely, I'm with family." "Mom," Denise spoke for the first time, her voice carefully patient. "You're 75. You need to be somewhere with proper support. What if you fall? What if there's an emergency? We can't be responsible for that." "I've never asked you to be responsible for me. That's not the point." Marcus leaned forward. "The point is that we all need to be practical. You need care appropriate for your age. We need space for our growing business. This is a win-win solution." Elowen felt something cold settle in her chest. They'd already decided. This wasn't a conversation. It was a notification. "And if I don't want to go to a facility?" "Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We've already contacted Meadowbrook Senior Living. They have an opening next month. We'll help you move, get you settled. It's really for the best." For the best. As if they were doing her a favor. As if they weren't discarding her like outdated furniture. Elowen sat silent for a long moment, thinking. Then she remembered something. "What happened to my mother's property? The farmland she left me?" Marcus and Denise exchanged glances. "That old place? Mom, it's worthless. Just an abandoned house and overgrown fields in the middle of nowhere. We couldn't even give it away when we were settling Grandma's estate. The property taxes aren't even worth paying." "But it's still in my name." "Technically, yes, but, Mum, you can't seriously be considering—" I want it. Elowen's voice was quiet but firm. Instead of the assisted living facility, I want to go to my mother's property. That's insane. There's no electricity, no running water, no services. The house is probably falling apart. You can't live there. Then I'll fix it. I'll manage. It's mine, and that's where I want to be. Marcus threw up his hands in frustration. This is exactly why you need supervised care. You're not thinking clearly. A 75-year-old woman alone in a ruined farmhouse. That's not independence, that's suicide. It's my choice. No, actually it's not. We're your family. We're trying to help you. If you won't accept help, we'll have to consider other options, legal options for guardianship if necessary. The threat hung in the air. Elowen looked at her son, really looked at him, and realized she was seeing a stranger. The boy she'd raised would never have threatened her like this. Money and success had changed him into someone who saw people as problems to be managed. She stood slowly. I'll be out by the end of the week, and I'll go to my mother's property. You don't need to help. You don't need to visit. Consider your obligation fulfilled. Mom, don't be dramatic. I'm not being dramatic, Marcus. I'm being clear. You want me gone? I'm gone, but I'll go where I choose, not where it's convenient for you. She walked out of the kitchen with as much dignity as she could manage, went to her room and started packing. 3 days later, with her belongings in a rental truck driven by a kind neighbor who couldn't believe what Marcus had done, Elowen headed to the property she'd inherited 5 years ago and never visited. Her mother's farm, 40 miles outside the city, in the rural countryside that progress had bypassed. The place Marcus called worthless. The place Elowen was now calling home. The drive took an hour on increasingly rural roads. Paved highways gave way to county roads, then gravel paths, then finally a rutted dirt track that made the truck bounce and shudder. Trees pressed close on both sides, branches scraping against the truck's roof. This was land that civilization had forgotten. Finally, the trees opened up into a clearing, and Elowen got her first look at her new home. The farmhouse was worse than she'd imagined. 2 stories. The white paint long since weathered to grey, shutters hanging askew, porch sagging dangerously on one side. Vines covered much of the structure, climbing up walls and across windows like the forest was trying to pull the building back into the earth. The yard, if you could call it that, was chest-high weeds and tangled undergrowth. Remnants of a garden fence poked through the vegetation like bones. An old barn leaned precariously in the distance, its roof partially collapsed. It was desolate. It was overwhelming. It was hers. The neighbor, Jim, whistled low as he parked the truck. Mrs. Hartley, are you sure about this? We could turn around right now. I know a nice apartment complex that... Thank you, Jim, but no. This is where I'm meant to be. They unloaded her belongings onto the porch, Jim clearly worried but respectful of her decision. He helped her pry open the front door, swollen from years of humidity and disuse, and they peered inside. The interior was dim and dusty, but surprisingly intact. Furniture covered in old sheets, hardwood floors, a stone fireplace. The bones of a good house, just neglected. At least stay with us tonight, Jim offered. Come back in daylight with proper supplies. But Elowen shook her head. I need to start now, while I still have courage. After Jim left, promising to check on her in a few days, Elowen stood alone in the house her mother had lived in for 50 years. The house where Elowen herself had spent summers as a child, running through fields and helping in the garden. That was 60 years ago. Everything had changed, but as she moved through the rooms, sweeping aside cobwebs and pulling sheets off furniture, memories returned. Her mother at the kitchen stove, her grandmother teaching her to identify plants in the yard, long evenings on the porch watching fireflies. This house held her history in a way Marcus's modern home never could. She found a camping lantern in her supplies and lit it as darkness fell. The house had no electricity, no running water, no heat. She had a sleeping bag, some canned food, bottles of water. She'd survived the night. She ate a cold dinner sitting on the porch steps, looking out at the overgrown land. The spring evening was cool but not uncomfortable. Stars appeared overhead, more stars than she'd seen in years, with no city lights to wash them out. In the distance, she heard an owl call. Despite everything, The exhaustion, the uncertainty, the enormity of what she'd taken on, Elowen felt something unexpected. Peace. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't walking on eggshells, wasn't trying to stay out of the way, wasn't feeling like a burden. She was alone, yes, but she was also free. But she slept that night in her sleeping bag on her mother's old couch, and if she cried a little thinking about how her son had discarded her, she also smiled, thinking about how she'd refused to go quietly. Tomorrow, she'd start figuring out what to do with this place. Tonight, she'd rest. The morning came early, announced by a chorus of birds that seemed impossibly loud after years of city living. Elowen woke stiff and sore. Sleeping on a couch at 75 was different from sleeping on a couch at 25, but determined. Her first priority was assessment. She needed to know what she was working with. She spent the morning exploring the house room by room with her lantern. The first floor had a front room, kitchen, dining room, bathroom. The second floor had 3 bedrooms and another bathroom. Everything was dated but mostly intact. The roof had some leaks. Water stains on the ceiling proved that, but it wasn't catastrophic. The plumbing and electrical were ancient and non-functional, but the structure itself was sound. Outside, the situation was worse. The barn was beyond saving, too dangerous to even enter. The fields were a jungle of weeds, saplings and vines. Years of neglect had turned what had once been productive farmland into a wilderness. But Elowen had been a gardener her whole life. She knew how to read land, how to understand what soil could produce. And as she walked through the overgrown fields, she began to notice things. The soil was rich, dark, not exhausted. The weeds were healthy and vigorous, which meant the land wasn't depleted. Water pooled in a low area, suggesting a spring or good drainage. This land wanted to grow things. It was simply waiting for someone to care. Over the next week, Elowen established her basic routines. She collected water from the spring she'd found, filtering it carefully. She cooked on a camping stove. She cleaned the house room by room, making it livable if not comfortable. She ordered a generator and basic solar panels, installed with help from Jim, who couldn't resist checking on that crazy old lady in the abandoned farmhouse. She began the slow process of clearing land, starting with the area immediately around the house. At 75, she couldn't work the way she had at 40. She had to pace herself, take breaks, listen to her body, but she could work steadily, and steady progress added up. Each morning she'd tackle a small section, cut back vines, pull weeds, clear brush. By evening she'd have a visible patch of progress. It was exhausting. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached constantly. She fell into bed every night completely spent. But she also felt more alive than she had in years. She was building something with her own hands. She was proving she still had value, still had strength, still mattered. Marcus called once, 2 weeks after she'd left. "Mom, you've made your point. Come home. We can work something out. This is my home now, Marcus. Don't be ridiculous. You can't survive out there alone. I'm managing just fine. For how long? What happens when winter comes? When you get sick? When you need help? Then I'll handle it. Like I've handled everything else in my life. Mom, Marcus, I need to go. I have work to do." She hung up before he could respond. She didn't need his doubt. She had enough of her own. 3 weeks after arriving, while cleaning out an upstairs bedroom that had been her grandmother's, Elowen found something that changed everything. The bedroom had been closed up for years, the air stale and thick when Elowen finally opened it. She'd been putting off this room because it felt like the most personal space, the place where her grandmother and then her mother had spent their final years. But it needed to be cleaned, and Elowen was running out of reasons to avoid it. She started with the obvious, stripping the bed, taking down curtains so old they disintegrated in her hands, sweeping up decades of dust. The closet was full of ancient clothes that she carefully folded into boxes for disposal. And then, at the back of the closet behind the clothes, she found a small door. The door was maybe 3 feet high, clearly leading to storage space under the eaves of the roof. Elowen had to crouch to open it, her knees protesting. The space beyond was dim even with her lantern, but she could see shapes, boxes. She pulled them out one by one. Most contained more old clothes, some papers, a few photo albums that made her cry with nostalgia. But the last box was different. It was wooden, handcrafted, with a small lock that had rusted through. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, were jars. Dozens of small glass jars, each labeled in her grandmother's handwriting. Elowen carried the box down to the kitchen where the light was better. She opened jar after jar, finding seeds. Not just any seeds, these were carefully preserved, organized, documented, and as she read the labels, her heart began to race. Lunar iris, last known bloom, 1962. Heartwood vine, extinct in wild, 1970. Ghost orchid variant, recovered from Cameron property, 1968. Her grandmother had been preserving seeds, rare seeds, possibly extinct seeds. There was more in the box. Notebooks filled with her grandmother's precise handwriting, growing instructions, soil requirements, germination techniques, cross-pollination notes. Her grandmother hadn't just been collecting seeds. She'd been a botanist, a preservationist, a guardian of rare plants. Elowen sat at the kitchen table, reading through the notebooks as the sun set. Her grandmother, who everyone had thought was just a simple farmer's wife, had been quietly preserving genetic diversity from plants that were disappearing from the American landscape. She'd collected seeds from old-growth forests before they were logged. She'd saved varieties from farms before they were bought out by agribusiness. She'd preserved what others had let die. The last entry in the notebook was dated 1983, the year her grandmother had died. "I'm old now and there's no one to pass this work to. Elowen is busy with her own life in the city. I don't want to burden her with this responsibility. These seeds will wait here. If they're meant to grow again, someone will find them. If not, at least I preserved what I could. Some things aren't meant to last forever, but some things are worth trying to save, even if we fail." Elowen sat in the darkening kitchen, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Someone will find them. She'd found them. After all these years, after being discarded by her own family, after being treated like she had nothing left to offer the world, she'd found her grandmother's life work, and maybe, just maybe, she'd found her purpose. The next morning, Elowen began planning in earnest. She wasn't just going to clean up this property anymore. She was going to resurrect her grandmother's garden. She was going to bring these extinct plants back to life. She was going to finish the work her grandmother had started 40 years ago. It was ambitious. It was probably impossible. But Elowen had nothing to lose and everything to prove. She studied the notebooks obsessively. Her grandmother had been meticulous, noting optimal planting times, soil conditions, companion plants. The information was all here. She just needed to follow it. She chose a section of the clearest land and began preparing it according to her grandmother's specifications. The soil needed amending. Her grandmother's notes called for specific ratios of compost, sand, and clay. Elowen had to order materials, figure out delivery to this remote location, work the amendments into the soil by hand. It took weeks. When the soil was finally ready, she selected the first seeds to try. Lunar iris, a flower her grandmother noted as remarkably hardy, good for beginners, breathtaking when in bloom. The seeds were 40 years old. They might not germinate. They might have lost viability, but Elowen followed her grandmother's instructions precisely, planting them at the correct depth and spacing, watering them according to the schedule, protecting them with cold frames she built from salvaged materials. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Elowen checked the plot daily, looking for any sign of life. She began to think this was foolish. Seeds didn't last 40 years. This was all wishful thinking from an old woman who'd been rejected by her family and was desperately trying to find meaning. Then on day 16 she saw it, a tiny green shoot pushing through the soil, then another, then a dozen more. The lunar iris seeds were germinating. Against all odds, her grandmother's 40-year-old seeds were coming back to life. Elowen knelt in the dirt and cried with joy. She wasn't just growing flowers. She was completing a legacy. She was connecting with her grandmother across decades. She was proving that just because something is old doesn't mean it's worthless. If 40-year-old seeds could still grow, then maybe a 75-year-old woman could still bloom too. The lunar iris took 3 months to flower, and when it did, Elowen understood why her grandmother had loved it. The blooms were extraordinary, large pale purple petals that seemed to glow in moonlight, hence the name. But it was more than just beauty. These flowers had been thought extinct for 60 years. No botanical garden had them. No seed bank preserved them. They existed now only because her grandmother had saved them, and Elowen had planted them. She photographed them carefully, documented their growth, and then did something that would change everything. She posted about them online. Elowen wasn't particularly tech-savvy, but Jim's teenage daughter had helped her set up a basic social media account and showed her how to post photos. My grandmother preserved these seeds in 1962. They were thought to be extinct. Today, they bloomed again. She didn't expect much. Maybe Jim would see it. Maybe a few neighbors. Instead, within 48 hours, her post had been shared thousands of times. Botanists were commenting, asking for verification. Plant conservation organizations were reaching out. A professor from the state university called her directly. "Mrs. Hartley, if what you're showing is genuine, and I have to verify that, you may have one of the most important private botanical collections in the country. These plants have been thought lost. If you have viable seeds, this is huge." Within a week, experts had descended on her property. They confirmed it. The lunar iris was genuine, and when she showed them her grandmother's notebooks and the other seeds, they nearly fainted. "Do you understand what you have here? You have genetic material from plants that vanished from the wild decades ago. This isn't just gardening. This is preservation. This is science. This is conservation history." They wanted to buy the seeds, the land, everything. Some offered enormous sums, but Elowen refused. "My grandmother didn't preserve these to sell them. She preserved them to keep them alive. I'll grow them, I'll share them, but I won't sell them." Instead, she made a deal. She'd partner with the university. They'd provide expertise, resources, and help. She'd maintain control of the land and her grandmother's collection. Together, they'd create a living seed bank and botanical preserve. Over the next year, the property transformed. With university funding and guidance, Elowen installed a proper greenhouse, irrigation systems, and research facilities. Graduate students came to help with planting and care. Her grandmother's seeds became her grandmother's garden, acres of rare and extinct plants growing again after decades. But Elowen was careful to maintain the spirit of the place. This wasn't sterile laboratory preservation. This was a living garden, beautiful and wild and accessible. She opened parts of it to visitors, school groups, garden clubs, anyone who wanted to see what could be saved, and she started a program teaching traditional seed-saving techniques to anyone who wanted to learn. Older women from nearby towns began showing up, many of them feeling useless and forgotten like Elowen had felt. She taught them what her grandmother had taught her, gave them purpose and community. The forgotten farmhouse became a center of activity. The property that Marcus had called worthless was now valued at over $2 million, not for the land, but for what grew on it. Elowen was interviewed by gardening magazines, featured in documentaries, invited to speak at conferences. She traveled to none of them. "Let them come here," she told Jim, who'd become her unofficial assistant. "This place is the story, not me." But of course, she was the story too. The 75-year-old woman, discarded by her family, who'd taken a ruined property and turned it into one of the most important botanical preservation sites in the region. People couldn't get enough of it. Elowen's life had become fuller than it had been in decades. She woke each morning with purpose. She spent her days working with plants and people. She went to bed exhausted, but satisfied. The loneliness she'd felt at Marcus's house was gone, replaced by community. But she never forgot how she'd gotten here. Never forgot the conversation at that kitchen table, the casual cruelty of being treated as obsolete. And when, 18 months after she'd left, Marcus finally came to visit, she was ready. He showed up on a Saturday morning in his expensive car, picking his way carefully through the now well-maintained paths. The property had been transformed. Professional landscaping, clear paths, the house fully restored with electricity and plumbing, flower beds bursting with rare blooms. The barn had been rebuilt into a beautiful workshop and classroom space. It was gorgeous. It was successful, and it was all Elowen's. Marcus stood looking around, clearly stunned. Elowen watched him from the porch, where she was having morning tea with 3 women from her seed-saving class. She let him stand there for a full minute before acknowledging him. Marcus, unexpected. Mike, this is amazing what you've done here. What I've done or what I've proven I'm capable of despite my age. He had the grace to look ashamed. Can we talk? We're talking now. Privately? Elowen considered, then nodded to her friends. They left tactfully, but not before one of them, Helen, a sharp-tongued 78-year-old, said loud enough for Marcus to hear, "We'll be in the greenhouse if you need us to throw him out." Marcus winced. They sat on the porch and for a moment neither spoke. Finally Marcus began. "I was wrong. About everything. About you, about this place, about what you could do. I'm sorry. Why are you here, Marcus? Did you come all this way just to apologize?" "Partially, but things aren't going well. The business is struggling. Denise and I are having problems. I thought maybe..." He trailed off. "You thought maybe now that I'm successful, I'd help you." Marcus's silence was answer enough. Elowen sipped her tea, looking out at the gardens her grandmother had dreamed of and she had built. "Let me tell you something, Marcus. When you threw me out, yes, threw me out, let's be honest, I was devastated. I felt worthless. I thought my life was over. But this place taught me something. Seeds can wait decades to grow, but they need the right conditions. Rich soil, water, light, care. I was like those seeds. I had potential, but your house wasn't the right condition. Here I could finally bloom. I know, and I'm proud of what you've..." "I'm not finished. You treated me like I was disposable, like I was a burden, like old age meant I had nothing left to offer. And now you're here because you want something. Not because you missed me, not because you realized I deserved better, because you need something." Marcus looked at his hands. "That's not entirely fair, isn't it?" They sat in silence. Then Elowen made her decision. "I'll help you. Not with money. This place is a non-profit now. Everything goes back into conservation. But I'll help you the way I help everyone who comes here. I'll teach you to work." "What? You want to be part of this? Fine. We need help. The beds need weeding. The greenhouse needs organizing. The paths need maintenance. You can come on Saturdays. I'll teach you what your grandmother taught me. And maybe, if you're willing to learn, you'll figure out that value doesn't come from how much money you make. It comes from what you contribute." Marcus stared at her. "You want me to do manual labor? I want you to learn what it means to build something real, to contribute, to be part of something bigger than yourself. That's the only help I'm offering. And if I say no, then you drive home and we have the relationship we have now, which is to say none." Marcus struggled with this. Elowen could see his pride warring with his need. Finally he nodded. "Okay, Saturdays. I'll come." "Good. We start at 7, bring work gloves." And that's how it began. Marcus came every Saturday. At first he was resentful, clearly feeling this was beneath him. But gradually something shifted. He met the other volunteers. He saw what they were building. He learned about his grandmother's work and what his mother had preserved. He got his hands dirty. He learned to care. Elowen never let him forget how he'd treated her, but she also showed him how to be better. Not through lectures, but through example, and slowly, painfully, their relationship began to heal. Not back to what it was. That was impossible, but forward to something new, something more honest. 2 years after arriving at the property, Elowen stood in the main garden during the spring bloom. The rare flowers her grandmother had saved were thriving, spreading, being propagated, and shared with botanical gardens and conservation programs across the country. The lunar iris that had started everything was now growing in 20 different locations. Insurance against extinction. The property had become exactly what her grandmother had dreamed of, a living library of genetic diversity, a teaching center, a place where forgotten things were remembered and valued. Visitors came every week. School groups learned about conservation. Researchers studied the plants. Older women found community and purpose. Elowen had built something that would outlast her, something that mattered. Marcus was there that day, as he was most Saturdays now. He'd brought his children, Elowen's grandchildren, teenagers now who'd barely known her when she lived at their house. They were learning to plant, to nurture, to see value in slow growth and patient care. Watching them, Elowen felt something complex. Not forgiveness exactly, Marcus had hurt her too deeply for easy forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. He'd been shaped by a culture that valued youth and productivity above wisdom and patience. He thought old age meant diminishment because that's what the world taught him. He'd been wrong, but he was learning. As the sun set over the garden, Elowen walked the paths alone, checking on plants, making notes in the journal she kept. She thought about her life's path, the marriage, the motherhood, the years of supporting others, the rejection, the rebirth. If someone had told her at 75 that her life was just beginning, she would have laughed. But it had been true. The abandonment hadn't been an ending. It had been a clearing away, making space for something new to grow. She thought about all the people who'd come through here in the past 2 years, the older women who'd told her they felt invisible, useless, forgotten, the ones who'd found purpose again in seed-saving classes and garden work, the ones who'd built community here, who'd learned they still had so much to offer. That was the real legacy, not the rare plants, though those mattered, but the reminder that value doesn't expire. That age brings wisdom and patience and understanding that youth can't match. That sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what truly matters. Elowen was 77 now. Her hands were more wrinkled, her back more bent, but she felt more alive, more purposeful, more herself than she had at 50. The world had tried to put her on a shelf to suggest her time was over. She'd proven them wrong, not through anger or bitterness, but through growth, through building, through blooming. As she walked back toward the farmhouse, her house now, truly hers in a way Marcus's house never could have been, she saw lights on in the greenhouse. Helen and some of the other women were there late, working on a propagation project. Through the window she could hear laughter. Elowen smiled. This was what her grandmother had wanted. Not just preserved seeds, but a preserved community. Not just saved plants, but saved people. A place where things society called worthless were recognized as valuable, where age was honored, not hidden, where slow growth was understood as real growth. She climbed the porch steps, her steps slower now, but steady. Inside she could see photos on the wall, her grandmother herself, the garden through the seasons, the people who'd found home here, a legacy in pictures. Tomorrow there would be more work, more planting, more teaching, more building. But tonight, Elowen could rest knowing she'd done what she set out to do. She'd proven that abandonment wasn't an ending. She'd proven that old things could still be vital. She'd proven that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you were always meant to be. In the morning, she'd wake early and walk the garden as the sun rose, checking on new growth, planning the day's work. She'd have tea with Helen and make plans for the summer workshops. She'd welcome the Saturday volunteers, including Marcus, and guide them in the day's projects. She'd live fully, purposefully, powerfully. Because Elowen Hartley had learned the most important lesson of her life. The world will try to tell you that your time is over. Your family might agree. Society might dismiss you. But you don't have to accept that story. You can write a new one. You can take the thing everyone else calls worthless and transform it into something extraordinary. You can bloom at 75 just as powerfully as you did at 25. You just need the right soil. And sometimes finding that soil means walking away from everything familiar and starting completely over. Elowen had done that, and in doing so, she'd built not just a garden, but a sanctuary. Not just a legacy, but a revolution. A quiet revolution that said, we are not finished. We are not obsolete. We are not less valuable because we are old. We are gardens that have had decades to grow deep roots. We are seeds that have waited our whole lives for the right conditions to bloom. And when we finally do bloom, we are magnificent. That was the story of the awakening of Elowen. Not a story about gardening, though gardens were part of it, but a story about refusing to be discarded, about finding purpose when the world said you were purposeless, about blooming when everyone said you were already wilted. It was a story about the power of age, the value of wisdom, and the truth that it's never too late to become exactly who you were always meant to be. Elowen had become that. And in doing so, she'd shown countless others that they could too. Thank you for listening to Elowen's journey. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What word represents how this story touched your heart? Resilience, renewal, strength, purpose, Drop a comment below with your word, and let's build a community of people who believe that life's most beautiful blooms often come later than expected. Another years that followed brought Elowen a kind of peace that could only come from living in complete alignment with purpose. She woke each morning in the farmhouse her grandmother had loved, made tea in the kitchen where 3 generations of women had prepared meals, and walked out into gardens that were simultaneously ancient and new. The lunar iris had become her signature plant, but it was only the beginning. One by one she'd worked through her grandmother's collection of preserved seeds. Some failed to germinate. 40 years was a long time, and not all seeds survived, but enough did. The heartwood vine, which hadn't been seen in the wild since 1970, now climbed the restored barn, its distinctive heart-shaped leaves and crimson flowers drawing photographers from across the country. The ghost orchid variant, so rare her grandmother had only managed to save a handful of seeds, now bloomed in the specially constructed shade house, its ethereal white flowers seeming to float in the dim light. Each successful germination felt like a small miracle. Each bloom was a victory over extinction, a middle finger to the passage of time that tried to erase everything beautiful and rare. But Elowen's greatest satisfaction came not from the plants themselves, but from what grew around them, the community. The property hosted workshops every month now, teaching seed-saving techniques that were rapidly becoming lost arts. Helen led most of these, her sharp wit and extensive knowledge making her a popular instructor. But there were others too. Margaret, who'd been a librarian before retirement and now ran the property's documentation project, ensuring every plant was properly recorded and researched. Rosa, who'd lost her husband and thought her life was over until she found purpose here, teaching children about pollinators. Dorothy, who'd been suffering from depression after her children moved away and who now managed the volunteer program with enthusiasm Elowen found infectious. These women, all over 65, all told by society they were past their useful years, had become the backbone of something remarkable. They weren't just preserving plants. They were preserving knowledge, building community, mentoring younger generations, proving that age was an asset, not a liability. The property had become famous enough that tour buses occasionally showed up, much to Elowen's dismay. She'd never wanted celebrity. She just wanted to finish her grandmother's work. But the attention had benefits. Funding flowed in through donations and grants. Other people came forward with their own family seed collections, expanding the preservation work beyond her grandmother's original cache. Universities partnered with them on research projects. The property became a living laboratory where graduate students studied plant genetics, traditional growing methods, and sustainable agriculture. But Elowen was careful to keep the mission clear. This wasn't about science for science's sake. It was about remembering that things society discarded still had value. About understanding that old didn't mean obsolete. About recognizing that sometimes the most important work was simply keeping something alive until the world was ready to appreciate it again. Marcus continued coming every Saturday. The work had changed him more than Elowen had expected. His tech consulting business had eventually stabilized, but he'd shifted his focus, now specializing in helping agricultural non-profits with their technology infrastructure. He donated his services to organizations doing preservation work. He'd brought Denise and the kids a few times. The visits were awkward at first, Denise clearly uncomfortable with the woman she'd so casually dismissed. But she too had softened, especially after her own mother died suddenly, and she realized how much time she'd wasted taking family for granted. The grandchildren, teenagers now, had become genuinely interested in the work. Elowen's grandson had done his high school science project on seed viability and preservation techniques. Her granddaughter had started a garden club at her school, teaching other students about rare and endangered plants. They weren't just visiting out of obligation anymore. They were part of the legacy. One evening in late summer, as the sun painted the garden in gold and amber light, Elowen sat on the porch with Helen, Rosa, Margaret, and Dorothy, her found family, the women who understood what she'd built here better than anyone. They'd just finished hosting a large workshop, 50 people who'd come to learn about autumn seed collection. Everyone had left, and the property was settling into peaceful quiet. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Marcus hadn't kicked you out? Helen asked, never one to avoid difficult subjects. Elowen considered the question seriously. Sometimes. I think I would have stayed in that room, making myself smaller and smaller, trying not to be a burden. I think I would have died there, maybe not physically but spiritually. I would have faded away until I really was as invisible as they tried to make me. Instead, you did this. Rosa gestured at the garden spreading out before them. Instead, I found what I was meant to do all along, Elowen agreed. I just had to lose everything first. Do you forgive him? Margaret asked. Marcus? Elowen thought about that. I don't know if forgive is the right word. I understand him better now. I see how culture shapes us, how we internalize these terrible ideas about age and value. He was wrong, deeply wrong, but he was also just unthinking. He hadn't questioned what society taught him. That's more generous than I would be, Dorothy said. He nearly destroyed you. But he didn't. That's the thing. He thought he was destroying me. He thought taking away my place in his house would break me. Instead, it freed me. Sometimes our greatest gifts come wrapped in terrible packaging. They sat in comfortable silence, watching fireflies begin to appear in the garden as darkness fell. In the distance, an owl called, the same sound Elowen remembered from her first night here years ago. What happens to all this when you're gone? Rosa asked quietly. They'd all been thinking it, but avoiding saying it. They were all old. Mortality wasn't abstract anymore. Elowen smiled. It continues. That's what we've built here. Not something dependent on one person, but a community, a mission, a living thing that can survive any of us. The university partnership ensures institutional support. The non-profit structure protects it legally. But more than that, we've trained dozens of people. We've inspired hundreds more. The seeds are saved, distributed, growing in multiple locations. Even if this property disappeared tomorrow, the work would continue. But it would still be your legacy, Helen insisted. Yours and your grandmother's. Yes, and I'm proud of that. But the best legacies are the ones that grow beyond their creators. We didn't just preserve plants. We preserved an idea. The idea that discarded things still have value, that old things still matter. That age is not diminishment, but accumulation of wisdom, of knowledge, of understanding. That's what will last. Later that night, alone in her grandmother's farmhouse, Elowen did what she did most evenings. She updated her own journals, documenting the day's work, recording observations, making notes for future plantings. She was creating her own legacy of written knowledge, just as her grandmother had. But she also wrote more personal reflections. She wrote about what she'd learned in these years, about resilience and renewal, about finding purpose when the world said you were purposeless, about the strange grace that could come from rejection and loss. She wrote about the women she'd met here, the community they'd built, about Marcus and his slow transformation, about her grandchildren and how they were learning to see value differently. She wrote about her grandmother, whose work had waited 40 years for the right person to continue it, about how legacy didn't have to be immediate. Sometimes the most important things we do don't matter until long after we're gone. And she wrote about aging, about what she'd learned about being old in a world that worshipped youth, about how the world told you that after 70, you were supposed to fade away, become quiet, stop wanting things, stop doing things, accept your irrelevance, about how that was a lie designed to sideline people who'd accumulated decades of wisdom and experience, about how old age, properly lived, was not a diminishment, but a flowering. All those years of growth, all that accumulated knowledge, all that hard-won understanding, it could bloom in the final chapters if you refused to accept society's narrative about aging. Elowen had refused, and in refusing, she'd shown others how to refuse too. That was perhaps the most important part of her legacy, not the preserved plants, though those mattered, but the preserved people, the women who came here thinking their useful years were behind them and discovered they'd been lied to, the younger people who learned to see their elders differently, the families who watched someone they dismissed accomplish something extraordinary. 3 years after her arrival at the property, Elowen was invited to give a talk at a national botanical conference. She almost declined. Public speaking had never been her strength, and the idea of standing in front of hundreds of experts was terrifying. But Helen insisted, "You have to go. This isn't about you. It's about showing people what's possible." How many other grandmothers out there have old seed collections in their attics? How many other elderly people have been sidelined when they still have so much to contribute? You have to tell the story. So Elowen went, with Helen and Rosa for moral support. She stood at that podium in front of 500 botanists, conservationists, and researchers, and she told the truth. She told them about being discarded by her family, about arriving at a ruined property with no plan and no hope, about finding her grandmother's seeds and recognizing a mission, about the work of bringing extinct plants back to life, about building community among people society had forgotten. And she told them this: "My grandmother saved these seeds because she believed they mattered, even though no one else did. She preserved them for 40 years, not knowing if anyone would ever plant them. That's faith. That's patience. That's wisdom that only comes with age. When I found those seeds, I could have sold them to the highest bidder. Companies offered me enormous sums. But that's not what my grandmother wanted. She wanted them to live, to grow, to continue. So that's what I've done. And in doing so, I've learned that seeds aren't the only thing that can wait decades for the right conditions to grow. People can too. I waited 75 years to find my true purpose. My grandmother's work waited 40 years for someone to continue it. Neither of us would have had our time cut short if the world had its way. If I'd stayed in my son's house, slowly fading away. If my grandmother's seeds had been thrown out with the trash. But we both persisted. We both waited. And we both bloomed when the time was right. I'm 77 years old. According to society, I should be winding down, accepting my limitations, preparing for the end. Instead, I'm just beginning. I found my purpose. I've built something meaningful. I've created community. I've preserved genetic diversity. I've taught hundreds of people. I've shown that old age is not an ending, but a continuation. The world tried to put me on a shelf. My own family tried to hide me away in assisted living. They said my time was over. They were wrong. My time had just begun. That's what I want you to remember. When you see an elderly person, don't assume they have nothing left to offer. Don't dismiss their knowledge because it's old. Don't think that just because someone has lived 70 or 80 or 90 years, they're finished contributing. Some of us are just getting started. Some of us needed those 70 years to develop the wisdom and patience required for our real work. Some of us are seeds that took decades to germinate. But when we finally do grow, we are magnificent. The conference gave her a standing ovation. The video of her talk went viral online. Suddenly, Elowen's story was everywhere. News articles, podcasts, documentary proposals. The attention was overwhelming and unwanted. But it served a purpose. Other elderly people reached out, inspired to pursue neglected passions. Other families reconsidered how they treated their aging relatives. Other communities started similar preservation projects. Elowen had become, accidentally, a symbol of something larger than herself, a symbol of the potential that exists at any age, of the wisdom and power that comes with time, of the possibility of blooming late. She handled the attention with grace, but always redirected it back to the work, to the plants, to the mission. This wasn't about her. It was about changing how society saw age, how families treated elders, how we valued or failed to value the wisdom that came with years of living. Eventually, the media attention faded. Trends moved on, but the work continued. The gardens grew. More rare plants were saved. More women found purpose. More families healed, and Elowen continued to bloom. Now, standing in her garden on this late summer evening, looking at what she'd built from nothing, Elowen felt profound satisfaction. She was 78. Her body was slower, more fragile. She knew her time was limited in ways it hadn't been at 75, but she also knew she'd done what she needed to do. She'd finished her grandmother's work. She'd proved her worth. She'd created something that would outlast her. She'd shown the world that age was not weakness. Tomorrow there would be more work, more planting, more teaching, more building. But tonight, she could rest in the knowledge that she'd lived well. She'd refused to accept society's narrative about aging. She'd transformed rejection into purpose. She'd taken something everyone called worthless and made it invaluable. She'd bloomed at 75 as magnificently as anyone could bloom at any age. And in doing so, she'd proved something essential. It's never too late. Never too late to find your purpose. Never too late to contribute. Never too late to build something meaningful. Never too late to refuse the story the world tells about age and write your own story instead. Never too late to bloom. That was Elowen's legacy. Not just the rare flowers, though those mattered. Not just the preserved seeds, though those were important, but the idea itself. The revolutionary idea that old age was not diminishment, but potential, that the final chapters could be the best chapters, that abandonment could be liberation, that sometimes losing everything was the only way to find what truly mattered. Elowen walked back toward the farmhouse as stars appeared overhead. Tomorrow she'd wake early and start again, but tonight she rested in peace, knowing she'd become exactly who she was always meant to be, and it had only taken 75 years to get there. Sometimes the best blooms come last. Sometimes you have to wait decades for the right conditions. Sometimes abandonment is actually freedom in disguise. And sometimes a 75-year-old woman with nothing left to lose is the most powerful force in the world. Elowen had proved all of that, and in doing so, she'd changed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed her transformation. That was the true flowering. Not the gardens, beautiful as they were, but the blooming of possibility itself, the reminder that life could begin at any age if you had the courage to plant yourself in new soil and grow. The awakening continues.